So welcome everybody to another I Am Sydney gathering. This is our July get together. We've had quite a few of these online so far and it's been fabulous because we've been able to connect with folks around Australia and beyond. And we might even have some of our New Zealand buddies and US buddies pop on too. So that's really cool. Today, I'm very excited because I especially love it when we have local speakers. It's one thing to, get folks who kind of, go about on the big speaking track, and we've all heard their names before, but it's a completely other thing when we hear our local people share, especially those that come along to our IADS group. So today is one of those, and Joe Joe, how do I pronounce your name properly, please?
Martorana-Nicotra.
Thank you.
That's right. That's
right.
Joe
is joining us today.
No worries.
To share her experiences. And Joe's going to go into that herself in terms of the details. But the heading that we've got for the day is Angels, Past Lives, and Trusting the Greater Plan. And from the time I've been able to spend with Joe and meet and just be in person-to-person company with her, I'm assured that this is the path that she walks. And having spent time with a lot of folks who have been through near-death and other types of extraordinary experiences, they change us profoundly on many levels. And it's always so lovely to be with someone who's been through one of these experiences and they've integrated and embodied those and walk that way in the world. And I know that to be true of Joe. So let me tell you a bit about her background. Joe is a spiritual light worker, tarot counselor and healer. And I might have to get one of these readings because it sounds like Joe just does these long intuitive readings. I think, Joe, did you just say on average they go about 2 hours?
Yeah, I mean, but I have had them as long as 4.
Goodness me. So, how delicious is that? So I won't go into any of the other background pieces because I think, Joe, that's all gonna, come through in what you're sharing, because of course, who Joe is today is weaved into where she's been, and what that's been about. So welcome, Joe, and thank you from all of us for being here to share with us your story.
Well, thank you, Nicole, and thank you also for giving me the opportunity to share it to everyone. And I'm very grateful to you all for coming and listening to me. It's really lovely. Okay, I'll have to set the setting first for why the near-death experience actually occurred. And I was a young 30-year-old studying to do my PhD. And I had a supervisor who who was very important to me, obviously, and he was a senior academic. And he really was the person who ruled the roost. And my PhD was totally dependent on his guidance and also his ability to guide me and to also open the avenues so that I could follow the research. So I was heavily dependent on him. And one afternoon, after many years of doing the PhD, we were invited to a conference. It wasn't that afternoon, it was a whole period of going to this conference. And I actually presented at the conference, and so did he. And the unfortunate situation was that the student was trying very much to please the supervisor and do her best at that conference. And so I put in a lot of effort and did a very, very good presentation. It was judged very good because of the Q&A session afterwards, which was very in-depth and went for a long time. He was in the audience, my supervisor was in the audience, and I don't think he felt comfortable at all with the fact that I had so much attention. So by the time he came to present, I was the innocent one in the audience as well, listening. It all went, I thought, fine when we got back to Sydney. And a few days later, he called me in and quite nonchalantly, as usual, just said, Joe, bring all your stuff, come on in, and we're going to reassess where you are at in this PhD and see what we need to do to move forward from here. And he then did something that was really unusual. He had 10 PhD students, and they were all female at the time, which should have been a big warning to all of us, really, but it wasn't. And he shut the door and locked it. And I remember standing in front of his desk. I sat down, I had the books on the floor, and I just felt this incredible fear when he locked that door. And I knew that there was something terribly wrong. The room was electric. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the next second came a, what can I say, a baptism of verbal abuse. Now I see it as verbal abuse, but back then it was verbal abuse, whichever way you looked at it. But I felt very, what's the word for it? I believed everything that he had to say about me. And at the time he was saying things like, you're, a hopeless PhD student. Your project is not worth anything. You really shouldn't continue. I'm going to make sure you don't continue. Now, at the time, I had won a scholarship to do the PhD because I had obtained first-class honours. And obtaining a scholarship for a PhD was quite rare in those days, and I still think it is. And that was a testament to what the academic world believed my abilities were. But at that time, he had completely annihilated me, actually, and that's how I took it on. And I remember begging for him to please allow me to stay on. He also threatened my scholarship at the time, and he said that he was going to report to the board that I had presented badly and that I had humiliated him in some way because I had presented so badly, that I was his worst student. So the shock at the time was very severe. And also I had to wait for him to unlock the door and allow me to leave. And at the time we had a mortgage, my husband and I, we had probably bitten off more than we could chew with regards to the mortgage. We were living off the scholarship. So there were 1,000 thoughts that were going through my mind, including the idea of where did I go wrong? Where did I go wrong? And I was quite passionate about my work. So ultimately, he finally unlocked the door. I walked out and, excuse the expression, I went straight to the toilet. And at the time, and this is going back to 1996, leaky gut and those sorts of symptoms were around, but no one really knew how to treat them. And the whole idea of probiotics was in its nascent form. No one talked about it. I remember there was only one form of a probiotic called Natrex at the time. And effectively what had happened was that I had a metabolic breakdown. Some people can have mental breakdowns. Mine was metabolic. My liver shut down. My intestines weren't working properly. My enzymes basically shut off, and I became what's called salicylate and amine sensitive. And what that means is that salicylate's in all vegetables, so I couldn't eat any vegetables. It's also in fruits, so I couldn't eat any fruits. And it's just a natural substance that protects fruits and vegetables from insects. It's like a natural insecticide. And amines is in all proteinaceous foods like cheese and meat and fish and eggs and milk. And as they get a little bit old, like a couple of hours old, they produce what's called amines, and I was also sensitive to that. So within 24 hours of that event, I couldn't eat anything to sustain myself. And I went through a rapid deterioration, got down to, I think, 45 kilos at one point, and then was still heading further down. And the worst of it was that the symptoms every time I ate something were horrific. Borderline anaphylactic reactions, which means inability to breathe, heart rate really fast, choking sensation, swelling, and this sensation of foreboding that you're about to leave the planet. And this went on and on and on. And it became a daily event. And going up to Myrna Vale Hospital, which is not far from where I live, was almost a daily event. And I ended up on an extremely reduced diet, barely any food that you could really live on. And then I was told I'd be like that for the rest of my life. 3 years later, during this journey, I came across the books on conversations with God. At the time, Neale Donald Walsh had only published one in 1995. And I read that voraciously, and it gave me a little bit of hope. But I was very, very sick. And then, as I said, 3 years later, when I had done everything possible to help myself, both physically and also from a psychological perspective, because having read Conversations with God, I knew, just even from that first book, that I had to forgive my supervisor for the perceived assault on me, because I understood by this stage that it was my perception. And so I had to try and forgive him. So at the time, I didn't have a lot of money for counselling because, as I said, we had this mortgage. And when I got sick, the scholarship ended, the Ph.D. ended, everything ended. And so I was slowly trying to talk myself and massage my thoughts. Anyway, I did get to the point, after a period of great anger, I did get to the point of being able to forgive him. And by this stage, it was 3 years later. And I'd done everything, as I said, from a psychological perspective, spiritual, of what I knew at the time to be spiritual, and also from a physical perspective. And one night, even with the few foods that I could eat, I was having an anaphylactic reaction. And I knew that this time I wasn't able to hang in there anymore. And I, out of sheer fatigue from the whole experience, I just decided that it was possibly time to go. And I just called on the Holy Spirit to take me, because there was no point. I couldn't live anymore, and I could see it. And the reactions was just so severe. And I was very fatigued by this stage. I didn't feel I could really live through that particular reaction that night. And I remember just surrendering to the Holy Spirit. I remember thinking about my mum and my dad and my sister, and praying that they would receive a message from the Holy Spirit to forgive me for leaving. And then I laid down for it to happen. I basically waited for death because I couldn't breathe, and I wasn't going to go to Mona Vale Hospital to be inflicted with another EpiPen to try and stop the horrific immune cascade happening. So I just remembered waiting, and I was lying on the bed when all of a sudden my field of view changed. In other words, my eyes were still open, but I was not in my bedroom anymore. And the best way I can explain it was that it was disappearing in patches, but it was disappearing. And when it was disappearing, it wasn't fading, it was instant. And I was instantly in the presence of an angel. And there was just light all around me. And this light was emanating from this magnificent angel. And the first thing I remembered was that I was fine. I don't remember struggling to breathe. There was no struggling of breath. There was no choking sensation. There was no heart rate that was racing as though I was running in the Olympics. It was instantaneous. And I can't even say I was breathing. I just know that my eyes were wide open and I was seeing her, and the amount of love that I was receiving was, the best words I can use is intoxicating. I couldn't get enough of it. It was beyond words that I can explain. And she was exactly like a Botticellian angel. Alessandro Botticelli, painted the Venus de Milo, and there are these cherubs and whatever. And she was not a cherub; she was an angel. And to me, she was female, and she had golden hair that was long, and I could see the wings, and I couldn't see her feet, and she was in a white robe. And the light was just incredible. And I was thinking, the other thing that I remembered recently was that I was also thinking why my eyes weren't hurting from the brightness. But anyway, so I remember her smiling at me, and I recognized her. And that was also strange, because I was saying to myself, I know you, I recognize you, my God, I recognize you. But I also knew that I had never seen her in my lifetime. So it's interesting, because at the time I couldn't speak. And I had this experience later on, which I'll describe. But I wanted to say to her that I recognized her, but I couldn't say it. And the next thing I know is that I'm actually speaking to her telepathically. But not like I made a conscious realization of it. It just happened as I tried to speak the words. And I knew that I couldn't. There was just no voice coming out. So it was telepathic. And I just hear myself say, like a young child, I know you. And it's this voice that's saying, I know you. And she smiles and telepathically communicates without opening her mouth. I am the angel of birth, but I'm at the angel of death, but I'm also the angel of birth. And it was, I remember being totally cognizant of it. Like, of course you are. I know you. And I was totally at peace. And if anything, at that moment, I really, really desired to go with her. And I remember thinking, now I understand why it is that little kids, you know, who die in the hospitals from illnesses and stuff, go so easily. And then I thought, and now I also understand why, you know, people go so easily. Because if they're seeing the vision that I'm seeing, you don't want to not go anywhere but with her. And she then opened her arms and she showed me this incredible scene. And the scene was of World War II airplanes, but also of World War I, or the biplanes. So there were these jet aircraft of World War II and biplanes, which much later on I found out was possible. But at the time, I thought, how can I be seeing World War II and World War I here? What's this going on? And I'm not a history buff, but I was given the answer later on, much later on, many years later. And I could see these planes shooting at each other, going da 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 da, and I could see the planes being hit, the wings falling, the fuselage heading straight for the ocean beneath her. And I could see that just before these planes were hitting the ocean, that the souls of the pilots were separating and coming up to her like a shimmer. And I noticed that the shimmering was coming out of the plane before it even hit the floor, the ground, the ocean. And I could see her sort of not collecting them with her arms, but moving them on towards the greater light that was to the side of her, which was very bright, but it was getting mixed in with her brightness. And I remember not understanding what she was actually showing me. And then the next thing I see is that I'm not in that field of view anymore. I'm in my mother's backyard, and it's instant. It was in between heartbeats. And this whole scene is occurring above my head. And the next thing I see is, no, hang on, at that point, I mustn't forget that, yeah. So in between that being moved across to my mother's backyard, she starts to move away. And so she's collecting these souls and she's moving away. And I feel the intensity of the loss of her moving away, because she was taking her love with her. And I'm thinking, oh my God, she's going. I've got to say something. And I hear myself say, if you have to go and leave me here, please ask God to heal me. I cannot serve. Now, up until that point, I had never used the words I serve or I cannot serve. I had never used the word service before in terms of a spiritual vocation. I was a teacher, and my Ph.D. was in the field of science, physics, in particular in physics education. I had never thought of myself as serving God in terms of teaching. So it was words that were coming through that I hadn't expected myself to say. And all I remember was the intense emotional pain that I was having as she was moving away. And she smiled at me, this incredible smile. And I knew when she smiled that God would receive my message. But I still remember the pain, the emotional pain. And the next thing I know is I'm in my mother's backyard. And I can see myself. And this World War II scene, World War I, World War II scene is still happening above me. And I then see this plane that gets hit, the wings fall off, and the fuselage is coming straight for me. And I'm thinking, this thing's going to hit me. And I remember thinking, well, if I was going to die, she should have taken me. I mean, this is ridiculous. This thing's going to hit me. And there's fear happening because I can see it's coming straight for me. But as it's coming straight for me, it's now a fuselage with no wings. It starts to contract. And as it contracts and gets closer and closer to me, it becomes the size of a thermos flask. And when it finally hits me, it hits me under my knees. And it hits my legs, and the pain, because it's coming in at full force, is excruciating, and I fall on my knees. And I see the thermos flask split open as it falls, as it lands on the floor. And as it splits open, the dog tags of the pilot that flew the aircraft fall out, along with a film strip, all curled up. Now, at the time, I had been working also with DNA, fishing DNA out of cells. This was independent of the physics work that I was doing. This was also for biology. I was involved in research, and I used to fish the DNA out of cells. You would have to lyse the cells with detergent, believe it or not, and then you'd put it in a centrifuge machine. It would spin it, and then what was left would be all the cell material, the debris at the bottom, and this stuff at the top. And if you popped in a glass, not so much a pipette, but just a I've forgotten what they're called, but just a glass stick rather than toothpick. We used to make them out of glass, and twirl it. You'd be twirling out the DNA as a string, like a gossamer bit of silk that is very sticky and winds itself. And this is what this string of this film strip looked like. And I immediately recognized it as the life of this pilot. And all I could think of was, oh my God, some mother is going to cry. This is really bad. And I picked up the dog tags and the film strip, and I said to myself, right, I'm going to have to take these two things to the authorities, and they're going to have to notify the young man's mother, right? The next thing I know is that I'm in my room. My eyes had not shut. And the instant that I go from my mother's backyard to my bedroom is just, it's instantaneous. And there's sort of like a breakup of the view of my mother's backyard. Almost, it reminds me of, I don't know if anyone ever saw Get Smart, but when that show starts off, and at the end of it, it's like a puzzle piece and the pieces all disappear, and it's the end of the image. And that's very similar to what happened. And the next thing I know is that I'm actually lying on my bed. There's no sign of anaphylaxis. I'm full of energy. I realize something extraordinary has happened. I literally jump out of bed, and I'm this feeling of excitement. I hadn't realized at the time that I had spontaneously healed, and that I had been healed. I just remember running up the stairs and telling my husband, and my husband was a little bit, he believed it, but he was also a bit incredulous. And by this stage, it was very late at night. I can't tell you how long, because I remember it was around about 8 o'clock, 9 when I went and lay down to die. I didn't look at my watch when the whole scene had vanished and finished. I don't remember looking at my watch even when I told my husband, except that my husband said, "It's late. I think we should go to bed and you need to sleep." And I can't even remember how I got to sleep, other than I did willingly go back downstairs. And I do remember thinking, I hope I'll see her again. And I went to sleep instantly. And then I woke up the next morning with incredible desire to eat apricot jam, which would have killed me. At that time, all I could have was, I could drink milk, I could have some cabbage, I could have some pear, and I could have some chicken. That's all I could eat. And that's all I had eaten for 3 years. So the whole idea of needing to eat apricot jam was I knew that would kill me at the time, but I didn't know I had been healed. And I remember getting the shakes and needing this apricot jam. And I was crying. I couldn't stop myself from crying because I was desperate for apricot jam. And so the best I could do was go up to Martorana Hospital. And at the time, there was this beautiful doctor, and he was Syrian, and his surname was Dr. Sarian. And I told him the story, and I said, "Look, I know that I'm desperate for apricot jam." And he looked at me and he said, I told him the whole story. When I think back now, if I had told anybody else, they would have thought I was mad. But I went and, God put into my field of view a doctor who would accept this. And he said to me, quite perceptively, he said, "Okay, we'll get some apricot jam." And he sent the nurse down to the kitchen, the hospital kitchen, to get me some apricot jam. And he said, "And we'll be ready to help you if you're going to have an anaphylactic reaction." But then he also said, he looked into my eyes and he said, "I think you're pregnant." And I thought, no, not possible at all. First of all, we barely made love because I was so seriously ill. In those 3 years, we may have made love maybe once a year. My poor darling husband at the time, who's now my ex, but anyway. And the last time we had made love was 6-7 weeks before, but I'd also had a heavy period as well, which was very, very typical of my disorder because it also affected my hormones badly. And so I just said to him, no, not possible. I had a shocker of a period, and that was 2 weeks ago, and not possible. But he interpreted the whole thing as the DNA, the film strip and the dog tags as me being with child. Anyway, I had the apricot jam, nothing happened. And I remember I ate, it was only a small jar, I ate the whole jar, nothing happened. And then he said to me, "I think you've been healed." He did the test, and lo and behold, I was pregnant. And he was quite worried at that point because I'd had the period. And he said to me, "You need to go see a gynae straight away." So he organised a gynae for me. So, I'm suddenly in this incredible world of having been healed from having, from surrendering, from the point of surrendering to leave, to being healed, to being told I might be pregnant, to actually then finding out that I was pregnant. And I remember it was breathtaking. And the next thing I know is that I was seeing the gynecologist or the obstetrician, who was then ordering immediately an ultrasound. And at that point, the technician who did the ultrasound said to me, when he did the ultrasound, he said, "Oh, this is a non-viable pregnancy." But I had been telling him, because I was still incredulous, I needed to digest what was happening. So I was telling everybody. And I wasn't even afraid that people might think I was Looney Tunes. So I was telling this technician, and he said to me, "Right, I'm not going to recommend a D&C here." He said, "I would like to see you again in 12 weeks or whatever it was, 6 weeks or whatever." And so he actually called my obstetrician and beautiful Dr. Jan Dudley. And she agreed. And she said, okay, we will wait. And then I went back, and of course it was a viable pregnancy, and it was my beautiful son, Richard. And by this stage, I was beginning to eat everything, and I was totally well. Subsequently, when Richard was born, he very early on began to show signs of being quite an exceptional little boy. And I don't mean that in terms, because every mother thinks their babies are exceptional, and so should they, because they're all gifts from God. But Richard was showing early signs of being very, very gifted. And at a very young age, he began to speak and was bilingual. He was bilingual by about 13 to 14 months. By 18 months, totally bilingual. And I remember, I mean, at 18 months, you know, they're still in their nappies and they're still little munchkins. And we went to Port Stephens and Nelson Bay, and there's a military museum there. I don't know if it still is there now, but there was one back then, and it was full of military aircraft. Now, I will state that my husband is an aviator, but he was as much against war as I was. So he's never had an interest in warplanes, and neither did I. And my son at this stage, because my husband was flying, hardly had contact with my son. In fact, for the first 6 months, my husband was never there because he was over in the US being trained. So, and we just never talked business at home. So Richard was never exposed to anything other than that he knew that his father was a pilot. So the next thing we know is that we're in this museum, and he starts to identify the aircraft. And he says, Luftwaffe, Luftwaffe. I didn't know what the heck Luftwaffe was. And it ended up being a Luftwaffe, which is a German military aircraft from the Second World War. And he could say Spitfire, and I didn't know what these things were. And the beauty of it is that my husband at the time was videotaping us on the old video 8 machine. And all of this is all videotaped. And you can see me sort of saying, what are you saying, darling? What are you just couldn't understand it. And he could even identify the biplanes that I saw. And by the time we walked out of there, we knew something was going on here. And stupid, at the time, it hadn't even clicked that this had anything to do, what my son was saying had anything to do with my near-death experience. It sort of came to me, it was slowly dawning on me much later on. But I then later on understood, because I had, by this stage, my son was about 4 when my pussycat started to die, and I went to see a clairvoyant for the first time in my life. And the clairvoyant told me that, yes, I would be putting my cat down, which was an anathema to me, the whole concept of it. And in the end, I did, because I couldn't bear to see her suffering. But she could see into that, and she could see that I would get to that stage. But she also could see everything that had happened to me and what I had seen. And then she said to me, your son was a pilot during the Second World War. And he died in a very disgruntled way, because he thought that what he was doing as an aviator during the Second World War, military aviator, was that he was a patriot wanting to be there to save his country. And he had found out that the squadron leader had betrayed the team. And as a result of that, he realised that everything that he had been made to believe about the war, the Second World War anyway, was an illusion. And that there are other things happening behind the scenes that hadn't, the general public had not been told. And so he died terribly deluded, not deluded, but terribly disillusioned. And I was also told at the time that I was the one who had lost that boy. So I came out of that clairvoyant reading in total shock. but the full ramifications of what actually had happened to me, including my encounter, my very negative, situation encounter with my supervisor and everything, didn't sort of come to fruition until 2019, last year, when my sister, who had been very ill with the same disorder that I had developed at that time, 21 years earlier, and she developed it because Dad died, and it was a grieving thing that caused her to develop a similar disorder. Only she suffers from severe migraine headaches every time she eats anything. And then last year she came very close to death. And when that happened to her, some of my food intolerances came back, my salicylate and amine food intolerances came back. And I knew that now I've got, three children and a family, that this was the worst thing that could happen to me. And I couldn't understand why. Although that I knew that somehow I was relating at a very deep level with my sister and taking on some of her grief and pain, and it was reminding me of mine, and it was bringing back these horrors. So I went to see a kinesiologist, and I wanted her to, find out from kinesiology what were the beliefs now that were causing this in my body, this dis-ease. And I remember that as she approached me and everything was fine, and she had already started to put me in circuit with her, and then all of a sudden she stepped back and put her arms up like this. And she said, "Can you see it?" And at that point, I could. And I remember I had the same sensation in my throat that I had when I saw the angel, and I couldn't speak. And she said to me, "What do you see? What do you see?" And I couldn't speak, and I knew where I was. And she said, "Where are you?" And it was interesting that she asked that question at the moment when I received the information of where I was. And I was barely able to say to her, my throat was so tight. And I said, "London." And then I said, "No." "England." And I said, "No." And she was very patient with me. She could see that I was trying to get it out. And all I could say was, "North of New York." And of course, that's the New England area. So, and she said, "Yes." But I still could not articulate New England. All I could say was north of New York. And all I could see was this very young, pretty young girl, about the age of 16, blonde. And I saw a time, 1840. And I just got this download of information as I was watching her. And it was in picture form and knowledge form, so that as I was seeing the pictures, I was receiving the knowledge. But I was also being protected from some of those images, so that I wasn't seeing the full image. All I was seeing and understanding instantly was that she was betrothed. She came from a well-to-do family, upper middle class, and they had a tutor. The parents had employed a tutor who was tutoring her, and she was wearing a bonnet and those very simple long gowns, very fluid long gowns, sort of cut under the breast, so it was just split here and down. And then it was very much this, I don't know if that's similar period as Pride and Prejudice, something like that. Anyway, 1840, and she was outside in a field. So she had a tutor who was teaching her, and she was also betrothed, and she was due to be married within 2 weeks. And she was very much in love with her betrothal. It just was one of those, happy instances that the family had betrothed her when she was young. She had met the young man and she fell in love with him. But it turned out that her tutor, who was a little bit older than her betrothal, had also fallen in love with her. And as it was getting closer and closer to the nuptials, he was getting more enraged that he couldn't have her. And I immediately realised, and I was shown, but only in snippets, not enough to frighten me, but I was shown that he raped her and choked her to death. Now, my kinesiologist at that moment, I can remember her saying, "Can you see what's happened?" And I remember saying to her, "Yes." And I was totally cool and calm because I didn't feel the emotions of what was happening. But I had two immediate thoughts. Oh, well, one major thought, and that was that I was a ghost because I was still there. And I had that instant knowledge. I'm a ghost. And I also knew that I was lying on the bed in 2019 on her bed with the kinesiologist next to me, and that I was also over there as a ghost and had been there since 1840. And she says to me, the kinesiologist says to me, why is she still there? And I hear her, the young woman, say to me, which is me, and I recognize her as myself. I recognize her as a young form of myself with my essence, my personality, but not as developed, because I've had several incarnations since then, and you develop. So I recognize the essence of me, and I'm quite innocent there, and also quite young. And she says to me, "I can't leave. My betrothal can't live without me. I have to stay here and look after him." And I immediately, the kinesiologist says, "Can you tell her the truth?" And I just telepathically hear myself say to her, "It's over. You can go. He's on the other side now. You don't have to stay anymore." And she, I don't believe she recognized me, but she accepted it straight away. So from that perspective, because I wasn't privy to her emotions at that point, I was only privy to my emotions in recognizing her. But the acceptance was instantaneous. It was without argument. And it was like, oh, okay. And I see her literally turn her back to me and start to fade. And she just disappears in front of me. And my kinesiologist basically went, "Wow, she's gone." And I said, "Yeah, she's gone." And at that point, I also instantly recognized, and this was the dual thought that happened when I said, you know, I immediately recognized that I was a ghost. I also recognized who had killed me. And the tutor who had killed me in that lifetime happened to be my supervisor for my PhD in this lifetime. And I recognized him straight away. And I remember while the kinesiologist then started working on me, that I was really thankful that I had had the opportunity to forgive him in my lifetime before I was healed. I forgave him, and I realized that I had no animosity towards him, even though I had just witnessed him raping and choking me to death. It was put to me later, and I'll mention your name, Karina. You might not like me to mention your name, but I won't mention surnames. But Karina, basically quite inspired, I think, by God, also mentioned that, you know, my life had been smothered in that lifetime. Also, in this lifetime, my career got smothered. And there was something else, Karina, that you had mentioned, but now it's just gone beyond me. But anyway, the thing is that it had come completely full circle. And I now had a full understanding of what had actually happened, and that I had full choice to let myself go as well, back in that 1840, to release myself as a ghost. So it was amazing. And and here I am now telling my story. And yes, my symptoms disappeared soon after that kinesiology session. They completely disappeared. So there you go, Nicole. That's my story.
Jo, right, what can I say? I mean, what a superbly extraordinary account. And I fully understand now why when you say it's not quite like other near-death experiences, I hear you fully in that there's many qualities. I mean, of course, each experience is unique in its own way, but I really hear some things there that stand alone in its own experience. And there's many places this discussion afterwards is going to go, I'm quite sure. I just especially want to highlight the, you know, coming around decades later. And it's so important. Thank you for sharing that piece, because often we can get very entranced by the experience itself and the content of that experience. And of course, it's very important how we integrate that and what happens afterwards and how we, you know, apply that in living and walking life. But to then have another experience much later that completes in many ways a story or adds other layers or dimensions of understanding to it is a wonderful gift in many ways. Yeah.
Also, I just remembered that it was just a few weeks after that whole experience that I then was watching a television show on World War II, where they happened to talk about the sinking of the Bismarck, which was a German ship in the Baltic region, Baltic Sea, and how the Bismarck was basically going to try and stop or get rid of the British ships in that area to stop also supply coming across from the Atlantic Ocean up towards from America, from the US, across the Atlantic Ocean to help supply the UK at that time during the Second World War to fight off the Germans. And the Bismarck, this huge ship that the Germans had built with their latest engineering and technology, was no match for the British ships. And at the time, it was also very difficult for the Spitfires to attack it. And lo and behold, the admiral at the time, the British admiral at the time, he was in a difficult situation, couldn't get a hold of planes, couldn't get a hold of anything. And there was an armada, there was a set of biplanes, British biplanes that were in an airport in Portugal during the Second World War. And he sent a desperate call to Portugal saying, can those biplanes take off and intercept the Bismarck? Which was an outrageous thing, but it was an act of desperation. And yet those biplanes were able to sink the Bismarck. And so there you have, I got this answer now of, you know, Luftwaffes, German Luftwaffes, British Spitfires and biplanes all being in the air roughly the same time. And that also solved my dilemma of why I happened to see World War I and World War II aircraft in the skies at the same time. And that answer came, I think it was within about 3 or 4 weeks from my kinesiology experience.
And you mentioned as well, Jo, trusting the greater plan. And I'm really curious because you came from a very scientific mindset when all of this started out. And now clearly, I mean, you do tarot, healing, intuitive work. So can you tell us a bit about that incredible transformation and I guess how it is you walk the world now?
Okay. Yes, it was, I was Catholic. I came from a Catholic family and I loved science and I had quite a scientific analytical mind. The whole experience, of course, you know, it was like pulling the rug from under my feet. The only thing that I had that prepared me for it was the fact that I had read Conversations with God, book 1. I read that book in the first year of my illness, and I remember that I was drawing on my Catholic faith, first of all, knowing that I was seriously, seriously ill. And when the doctor had said to me, you're going to be like this for the rest of your life, that was around about the time when I was desperate. And it was like, my God, you know, why have you forsaken me type thing? You know, I'm a good Catholic girl. I go to communion every Sunday. What's happening? And I remember going to a bookshop here in Moraywood, and I walked in, and there was the religious section, and there was this one book, and I picked it up, opened it up, read it, and thought, what a load of crock, and closed it and put it down. And from the minute that I walked out of the bookshop, I kept hearing and seeing this book in my head, and I couldn't get rid of it. And I was justifying to myself over and over, this is rubbish. It's just that book's rubbish. And I came home and I dreamt of that book every single night for 7 nights, a whole week. And by the end of the week, I had been beaten up into a pulp by this constant book coming into my head. And I went back to the bookshop, and there it was, untouched. It was the first edition, and it was hardcover, and it had a white covering on it. And it was just still sitting there exactly where I'd left it. No one else had, looked as though no one else had picked it up. I bought it, and I remember my hands shaking when I brought it and thinking, I really should be reading the Bible. But I was reading this. So that was, when I read that book, it had actually answered many questions that I had asked myself since a very young age. Although we were Catholic, I did have early interests in different things. Like my mother had brought a book home from the library. She was staunch Catholic, still is. She brought a book home from the library saying that Jesus Christ had ventured into India during the period of the Bible where he's missing, so to speak. And so, because from when Jesus Christ is baptized by John the Baptist to the later events, there's a gap there. And this book said that he actually travelled the world, and he travelled to India. Now, I remember Mum reading this book and saying, can you believe this? And I remember wondering. And the other thing that I couldn't understand about the Catholic Church was that animals don't get to heaven. And I really loved my animals, my cats. And it's like, how can it be that animals don't get to heaven? I can see the soul in my cat's eyes. So there was already questions, and this book had already answered them. And I knew that although the first book doesn't talk about any sort of thing, anything like near-death experience or anything like that, I believe it had sown a seed within me, unbeknown to me, that rendered it more able for me to accept what had happened. Of course, I had the evidence in my face. I had completely healed. The other thing also that happened was that, of course, I was pregnant. And when I had little Rich, as I said, he showed signs of genius, of brilliance. So he started to read at 18 months. And he also had a photographic and auditory memory. And I remember I read him a 10-page little golden book. You know, I don't know if you remember Little Golden Circle, I think they were called books. And there was something like 5 lines to a page, and they had 10 pages, and it was a little story, but it was all written in prose like a poem. And I remember I had read it to him no more than about 4 or 5 times, not consecutively, just every second or third night when he'd say to me, can you please read it? And unbeknown to me, he was memorizing it. And on the 5th time that I read it, he said to me, I want to read it back to you, Mama. And he just verbalized it, the whole book. This is an 18-month-old who can, and I've got it all on videotape. And I knew something was really happening here. I thought, this is really, really strange. And I would take him to the library. I would take him to the bookshop to buy books because he was ravenous. He wanted to know about books, and he wanted to read books, and he was beginning to learn to read. And we went to Big W at Warringah Mall. And the children's bookshop, the children's books were on one shelf, and above it, this is Big W. This is how crazy is this? Above it, there were tarot cards. And I knew nothing about tarot cards other than the fact that, oh my God, if you're Catholic, you don't do tarot. It's devil stuff, devil stuff. By this stage, of course, I wasn't Catholic anymore. I was far more spiritual. I had no religion. I just believed in spirituality and my connection to God, because the other thing that I had also learned from my whole near-death experience was the fact that reincarnation existed, because I saw what ended up being my son. And my son was back and back to me. So I had to accept the concept of reincarnation. And this is why I ended up, you know, giving up the whole idea behind the Catholic indoctrination. The fundamentals are correct, but the indoctrination isn't, and all the rest of the stuff that goes with it. And they did get the crucifixion and resurrection all mixed up, concentrating only on the crucifixion. But anyway, so these tarot cards fell on my lap while I was crouching down with my son getting a child's book at Big W. And they fell 3 times, because both times I put them back up. And I remember on the 3rd time they fell, I was really cranky, because I thought, gee, this could hit a child's, you know, head, and they're heavy. And I was about to get up and go straight to Big W's manager and say, these, you know, you've got really shonky shelves here. These tarot cards keep falling, and the kids are little, and you've got the children's books underneath. But as I'm doing that, my son looks up at me, and out of the mouths of babes, he says to me, Mummy, don't you understand? They're for you. And the first deck of tarot was an angel tarot, angelic tarot, and by Doreen Virtue. And it was from then on that I remember buying it, because my son was saying, this is for you. And I went home, and with trepidation, I opened it and I started using it. And then I began to notice that I had this gift. And when I noticed that, I got really scared. I got really, really scared. And I didn't use it for a very, very long time, because the cards were showing me who was going to leave the planet. It was showing me who was sick, and how they were sick, and why they were sick. And I realized instantly the power of these cards, and I didn't necessarily want the responsibility. It wasn't until, so that was 1999, so it must have been 2008. I had another, not a near-death experience, but another very severe illness. 2008, I began to use them sporadically, only amongst family, because I still didn't want the responsibility. And only when I was really pushed by family and a few friends. Then in 2015, I developed infectious mononucleosis, which is glandular fever. My husband had gotten it in Abu Dhabi. We were here in Sydney with the children. He was a pilot in the Emirates. And we went over there, because we were living over there. We were here in Sydney to see my mother and my sister. And he rang and said, oh, I've got glandular fever. And I remember going to the doctor, and the doctor said, oh, most people have been exposed to glandular fever. Let's do a blood test and see. And I turned up with antibodies to glandular fever, which meant that I must have had it sometime in the past, which is what the doctor suspected. He said 90% of the population has antibodies to it. And he said, your children are not in the age group to get it, so they'll be right. So I went back to Abu Dhabi thinking I was fine. And my homeopathist at the time also gave me some no-sodes against glandular fever, so I thought it was fine. And of course, my husband at that time, when I got home, wanted to make love that night, and infected me with glandular fever. But nobody knew that glandular fever, the type of glandular fever in the Middle East, is a variant that can actually kill you. Sorry about that, the light's gone out. Is a variant that can actually kill you. So within 3 weeks, my bone marrow stopped functioning, my liver stopped functioning, my spleen blew out of proportion. It just really expanded, because my blood cells were basically lysing, which means bursting. and I was 24 hours away from septicemia, and I was in hospital, and I knew I was very ill. And then I remember realizing that possibly the reason why this was happening was because I wasn't fulfilling my my role in life. And I made a promise at that point to the Holy Spirit that if I could be allowed another chance at life, that I would dedicate and devote my whole life to serving with tarot and spiritual counselling. And I recovered, and I haven't stopped serving since, and I do so out of joy and love. Joy and love because I love humanity, I love people, and I want to, my whole raison d'etre now, my whole life is using the tarot to help people understand what their truth is and to live their truth. And that's what I do.
Jo, what a pleasure and an honour to hear your story and your sharing. I have 100 questions, but we're going to end it here so that other people can jump in, because I know if I have 100 questions, so do they. From the bottom of my heart, Jo, I just am filled with gratitude for all that you've shared. It's not easy to share these stories. They're incredibly personal. Thank you also to your family for, having the freedom to share this stuff, because they have ripple effects, these experiences. So please pass our thanks on to everyone. So we'll end our official recorded part here. And of course, those listening to the playback, join us on the mailing list so that you can join us on future sessions. All those details will be posted wherever this video is posted. So on behalf of I and Sydney, Jo, thank you.
And thank you for having me. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story.